In the cold, rain-soaked autumn of 1987, 26-year-old Mara Sutton inherited a silence so heavy it had its own weight. It settled over the 280 acres of her mother's depleted Saskatchewan wheatland like frost that never quite lifted, even in July. She inherited the listing red barn with its rotting sill plates, the John Deere tractor that burned more oil than diesel, and a farmhouse kitchen that still smelled of her mother's bread, even though no one had baked in it for 3 months. But most of all, she inherited the worry, a specific, particular kind of prairie worry that gets passed down through generations the way some families pass down china or silver, the worry of a land that is slowly, quietly giving up. Her mother, Ruth Sutton, had farmed those acres alone for 11 years after Mara's father left for Edmonton and didn't come back. Ruth had been a strong woman in the way that prairie women are strong, not loudly, not with any fuss, but with a constancy that outlasted every hard season thrown at her, and yet the land had still beaten her. Not all at once, not dramatically. Just slowly, the yields had thinned year by year, the soil growing paler and more powdery with each spring seeding, until the farm was running on borrowed money and borrowed time in roughly equal measure. When Ruth's heart gave out on a Tuesday morning in September, she left behind a daughter, a mortgage, and 47 years' worth of observation journals she had kept in a wooden crate under the bed, in the room where she'd slept since she was a girl. Mara read those journals through October. She'd grown up on the farm, had left it at 18 for the University of Regina to study environmental biology, had come back for summers and Christmas and nothing in between. She had always felt slightly guilty about that, about leaving Ruth to manage alone. Reading the journals was like sitting across the kitchen table from her mother for the first time in years, really sitting there, really listening. Ruth had written about everything, the angle of the snow in February and what it told her about the melt, the way certain fields drained and certain fields drowned. She had written about the smell of the soil after a summer rain, how in the early years it had been rich and dark and fungal, like a forest floor, and how by the mid-'80s it had started to smell like nothing at all. Damp powder. She had noticed, and she had written it down, and nobody had listened, because she was a woman, farming, alone on the edge of a small town, and her opinion about soil smell was not something the men at the co-op had time to consider. In the back of the last journal, dated just 2 months before she died, Ruth had written something that Mara read 3 times before she fully understood it. The field by the Eastlow has always outperformed the others by a margin I cannot explain through rainfall or drainage alone. It is the only field that borders standing water. I wonder if it is the proximity. I wonder if what the water carries is the difference. Mara had grown up walking the east field with her mother. She knew the slough her mother meant, a shallow, murky body of water that collected snowmelt every spring and never quite dried up, even in drought years. It was ringed with cattails and thick with algae in summer, and it attracted enough mallards that Mara had learned to identify 7 species of duck before she was 12. It was also, by the standards of every agronomist who had ever set foot on the Sutton farm, completely useless. Dead water, one had called it, a drainage problem. But her mother had noticed that the wheat closest to it grew differently. Mara spent 2 weeks after the funeral driving the property, walking the fields, standing at the edge of the slough in her rubber boots, and staring into the water the way her mother used to. She had 4 years of environmental biology behind her and a particular interest in wetland ecology, and she stood at that slough edge and she started to understand something. The water wasn't dead. It was extraordinarily alive. The algae, the decomposing cattail roots, the thousands of small invertebrates cycling through the muck, all of it was producing something. Nutrients were moving through that water constantly, being broken down and rebuilt by bacteria in a chain that had been running uninterrupted since long before the first wheat was ever seeded on this land. The field bordering the slough was being fed by overflow, slow seepage, almost invisible, carrying a thin wash of nutrient-dense water out into the soil whenever the water table rose, even fractionally. Her mother hadn't known the mechanism. She had just known the result. Mara knew the mechanism, and she knew it could be scaled. She drove into Weyburn on a Thursday and spent 6 hours at the library. She found papers on constructed wetlands and integrated pond crop systems and a particular study out of the University of Guelph on natural nitrogen cycling through freshwater systems. She photocopied everything and drove home with ink on her fingers and an idea forming that she was almost too afraid to say out loud. Almost. What she did next is the part that made her a subject of conversation at the Sutton feed store for the better part of 3 years. She took the small amount of money left in her mother's account. Not much, not even close to enough to buy a season's worth of chemical fertilizer. And instead of driving to the ag supply depot in Moose Jaw, she drove east to a fish hatchery near the Manitoba border. She was looking for yellow perch. Specifically, she wanted juvenile breeding stock, enough to seed a system. The man at the hatchery looked at her for a long moment when she explained what she needed and what she intended to do with them. Then he sold her the fish without further comment, because he was a practical man and she was paying cash. She drove back in the early November cold with 3 large transport tanks in the bed of her mother's truck, the water sloshing gently, the fish invisible in the murk. When she got back to the farm, she did not bring them to the slough. The slough already had its own ecosystem, and she didn't want to disrupt it. Instead, she spent the following week digging, or rather, directing the rented excavator she'd hired from a man named Bergstrom in town to dig a shallow constructed pond at the highest point of the farm, connected by a series of shallow channels to the main irrigation lines that ran between the 3 lowest performing fields. She seeded the pond with water from the slough, 2 buckets carried by hand, full of the biological soup that had been quietly feeding her mother's east field for years. Then she released the perch. Her closest neighbor, a man named Mr. Calloway, whose land ran along her western fence line, and who had farmed with anhydrous ammonia and the conviction of a man who had never once had cause to doubt himself, stopped his truck on the road and watched her for a long time. He had known Mara since she was small. He had respected Ruth. He was not a cruel man. He rolled down his window and called across the field. "Mara, what in the devil are you doing?" she told him, clearly, directly, without apology. He sat with that for a moment. His expression was not unkind. It was the expression of a man who is watching someone he likes make a mistake they won't recover from. "Your mother would have gone to the bank," he said finally. "My mother went to the bank 11 times, Mara said. "That's part of why the soil looks the way it does." Mr. Calloway drove away. He told the story at the co-op that afternoon with the tone of a man delivering a sad report. The Sutton girl had come home from university with some ideas. Grief did funny things. Give her a season, they said. She'd come around. The formal objection arrived in December in the form of Miss Caldwell, the regional agricultural extension officer for that district. He was a trim, efficient man who carried a clipboard the way other men carried a sidearm, as evidence of authority. He had heard, he said, that she was experimenting with some kind of aquaculture integration, and as her extension officer, it was his responsibility to make sure she understood the agronomic realities of her situation. He walked the property with her in the thin December light, his breath making small clouds, his eyes moving over the dormant fields with a practiced appraisal. when she showed him the pond and explained the channel system and what she expected it to produce in terms of nitrogen, loading to the irrigation water, he was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke carefully, the way careful men speak when they are choosing words that will not get them into trouble later. I appreciate that you've brought a scientific background to this, he said. That's not nothing. But what you're describing has a 2 to 3 year establishment period before you'd see any measurable nitrogen output at agricultural scale. You don't have 2 to 3 years. You have 1 planting season, possibly 2, before this property goes back to the bank. What I can do is help you access the Emergency Soil Restoration Program and get you a subsidized fertilizer application that will get a crop in the ground this spring. That's the practical solution. It's a practical solution for 1 season, Mara said. Sometimes 1 season is what you have, he said. She thanked him. She did not take his advice. He drove away and wrote a note in her file that he later described to a colleague as the most polite refusal he'd ever received from someone who was almost certainly about to lose their land. The more dangerous visitor came in February. His name was Mr. Desjardins, and he represented a large agricultural inputs company based in Calgary. He had done his research. He knew her mortgage number, approximately, and her yield history, and he knew that she had declined Mr. Caldwell's subsidized program. He came in a truck that was too clean for a Saskatchewan winter and sat at her kitchen table with a proposal printed on glossy paper. He was not contemptuous. He was charming, which was worse. I've read about what you're attempting, he said, and I want to be clear. I'm not here to discourage you. What you're describing, the integrated wetland approach, there's actually peer-reviewed support for parts of it. I respect the science, but respect doesn't pay a mortgage, he smiled. He had a good smile. What I can offer you is a full input package, seed treatment, nitrogen micronutrient blend, on a deferred payment structure. No payment until after harvest. We take on the risk with you. You get a crop in the ground, you protect the farm, and you pursue your pond project on the side without it being a life-or-death gamble. He pushed the glossy paper toward her. It was a generous offer. It was also, she understood, a door that, once walked through, would never quite close again. My mother deferred payments, Mara said, 4 times. The structure of the offer isn't the problem, Mr. Desjardins. The structure of the industry is the problem. He looked at her steadily. The charm dialed back a fraction, and something more honest took its place, a kind of reluctant regard. You understand that if this doesn't work, he said, you lose everything she built. I understand that, Mara said. He gathered his paper and left. He told his regional manager later that the Sutton woman was either going to be very right or very ruined, and he genuinely didn't know which. Let me stop here for a moment, because I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever made a decision that nobody in your life agreed with? Not just a decision that raised eyebrows, but one that made the people who loved you genuinely afraid for you, one that required you to trust something so interior and private that you couldn't even fully explain it. Not because you didn't understand it, but because the explanation required a kind of faith that doesn't translate into a conversation over a fence line. That is where Mara Sutton stood in the winter of 1988, with a pond full of juvenile perch and fields that would need to produce a crop by September, or she would lose her mother's farm. She had one advantage that no one else knew about. She was not, in fact, flying blind. The environmental biology degree that had made Mr. Caldwell speak to her carefully, and Mr. Desjardins' smile, his cautious smile, had included 2 years of wetland nutrient cycling research. She understood exactly what she was building. A constructed wetland is not a miracle. It is a system, a deliberately orchestrated version of what happens in every healthy pond, marsh, and slough on Earth. Fish produce ammonia as waste. Bacteria, specifically nitrifying bacteria, convert that ammonia first to nitrites and then to nitrates. Nitrates are the form of nitrogen that plant roots can actually absorb. In a natural, oxygenated system with sufficient biological mass, this conversion happens continuously, producing a steady, gentle, perfectly bioavailable supply of plant nutrition. The problem with most prairie irrigation systems was that the water was sourced from deep wells or municipal lines, sterile, mineral poor, biologically empty. When you sprayed it on chemically exhausted soil, you were adding moisture to a medium that had lost its capacity to use moisture well. The chemicals had killed the mycorrhizal networks, the bacterial colonies, the earthworm populations, all the living infrastructure that made soil function as something more than a substrate for roots. What Mara was building was a biological engine. The perch were not decoration. They were a nutrient factory. The channels were not aesthetic. They were delivery lines. Every time she opened the gates to irrigate, she would not be watering the fields. She would be feeding them, delivering a warm, oxygenated, nitrogen-rich biological tea directly to soils that had been on a chemical IV drip for 20 years and had forgotten how to eat. She had done the math. She knew the nitrogen output would be low in year 1. Not nothing, but low. Low enough that her yields would likely fall short of the county average. She had calculated this and decided it was acceptable because she had also calculated her costs. No fertilizer inputs, no soil amendment chemicals, no pesticide applications, because healthy plants with functioning root systems and active soil biology resisted pest pressure in ways that chemical-dependent crops did not. Her break-even yield was lower than anyone else's because her operating costs were a fraction of anyone else's. She had not shared these calculations with Mr. Caldwell. She had not shared them with Mr. Desjardins. There was something in her that understood the calculations wouldn't matter to them. Not because the math was wrong, but because the math contradicted a story they had already decided was true. The first winter was the loneliest of her life. She drove the perimeter of the fields in the deep cold, checking the pond, monitoring the water temperature, reading the dissolved oxygen levels with a handheld meter she'd ordered from a scientific supply catalog. She ate soup and read her mother's journals again. She found, in a journal from 1979, a passage she'd missed the first time through. Some days I think the land is tired in the way a person gets tired when they've been asked to perform the same task without rest for too long. Not broken, just exhausted. What would it take to give it a rest that actually restored it? Her mother had been asking the question. Mara was building the answer. Spring seeding was hard. She seeded with saved seed, an older heritage wheat variety her mother had maintained for years, less showy in yield potential, but notably more disease-resistant. She used no chemical seed treatment. She held her breath and planted. The summer was dry, not drought-level dry, but dry enough that Mr. Calloway was running his center pivot irrigation system 16 hours a day and posting losses on social media in the particular prairie way of declaring disaster before it fully arrives. Mara's system ran 8 hours a day. The nutrient-rich water from the pond moved through the channels, out through the irrigation lines, and into the fields in slow, consistent pulses. She watched the wheat. In July, something happened that she hadn't fully expected, or rather, hadn't let herself hope for. A colleague from her university program, a soil scientist named Dr. Yoon, who was doing field work across the prairies, stopped by unannounced. He walked her fields for 2 hours. He crouched down and pushed his fingers into the soil and smelled it and crumbled it in his hands. He came back to the farmhouse porch and looked at her with an expression she didn't immediately recognize. "Your aggregate stability is measurably better than your neighbor's field," he said. "I can tell just by hand." "How are you irrigating?" she told him. He asked to see the pond. She showed him. He was quiet for a long time at the edge of the water, watching the perch move in the shallow clarity. "How did you know?" he asked. "My mother noticed the east field outperformed by the slough," Mara said. "I just understood why." He left and sent her a letter 2 weeks later asking if he could return in the fall to take soil samples for a study he was developing. She said yes. The crisis came in August, as crises in farming tend to. A sustained heat event settled over the province for 11 days. Temperatures that had no business being in Saskatchewan in August sat there regardless, untroubled by anyone's opinion of their appropriateness. The wheat across the region showed heat stress. Mara's fields showed it too. There was one afternoon when she stood at the edge of the middle field, and the wheat looked to her like a patient who had taken a bad turn overnight. The leaves were curling at the tips. The color was off. She stood there for perhaps 20 minutes, and in those 20 minutes she thought about the bank. She thought about her mother's face in the last year of her life, the particular weariness of a woman who has fought the same fight for too many seasons. She thought about Mr. Desjardins' glossy paper and the fact that his phone number was still on her kitchen counter. Then she went back to the pond. She increased the water circulation. She opened the irrigation gates wider. She ran the system through the night and the next night and the night after that. She fed the land the way you feed someone who is sick, more carefully, more consistently, more patiently than usual. By the end of the heat event, her wheat had recovered. Not spectacularly, but it had recovered. The harvest numbers that September were not remarkable. Her yield was 6% below the county average, but she had spent 40% less on inputs than any comparable operation in the region. She turned a small profit. It was the first time the Sutton farm had been profitable in 8 years. She took the soil samples herself that fall, a dozen cores from across the property, and sent them to a lab in Saskatoon. When the results came back in November, she sat at her mother's kitchen table and read them twice. Organic matter content up from 1.1% to 1.6% across the sampled fields. Microbial biomass carbon significantly elevated above baseline. The east field, the one that had always bordered the slough, read 2.1% organic matter, the richest soil on the property. The pattern was unmistakable. The living water was doing exactly what she had believed it would do. She permitted herself one evening of private satisfaction. She made her mother's soup, the barley one, with the smoked meat, and she ate it alone at the kitchen table with the soil report and her mother's journals spread out around her, and she allowed herself to feel the particular quiet joy of a thing that has been proven true after you have staked your life on it. The second year, the numbers improved. The third year, they surpassed the county average for the first time. The wheat was a deeper green than her neighbors, a green that came from roots drawing on living soil rather than from the forced flush of synthetic nitrogen. Her pest pressure dropped to the point where she discontinued the one pesticide application she'd been maintaining as a hedge. The plants were, in a word, Dr. Yoon, used in the paper he eventually published with her as a co-author, robust. It was not a dramatic word, but it was the right one. It was 4 years after she had first released those perch into the pond that Mr. Desjardins returned. He drove up on a Tuesday in October, after harvest, in the same two-clean truck. He was not quite as polished as before. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there, and the energy sector volatility of the late 80s had done nothing kind to the cost of producing anhydrous ammonia. Farmers in the region were squeezed. Several had sold. The glossy paper approach was working less well than it had. He found her in the equipment shed, sharpening a worn sweep on the cultivator. She looked up when he came in and waited. "I owe you an acknowledgement," he said. He did not say apology. He was too careful a man for apology. What you've built here, my company has been watching it. Dr. Ewan's paper made certain people pay attention. He paused. We're developing a product line, biological inoculants, mycorrhizal blends. We think the market is moving toward what you're doing. We'd like to discuss a formal consulting relationship. Your methods, your data, we'd compensate you appropriately. Mara set down the file. She looked past him through the open equipment shed door to the pond, which was perfectly still in the October light, the cattails she'd allowed to establish along its edge browning at the tips, the perch invisible under the surface. My methods aren't a product, she said. He waited. What I've built here took 4 years and my mother's journals and a particular quality of attention that I don't know how to package. The knowledge belongs to this land. If someone else wants to build something like it, they need to learn to pay the same kind of attention to their own land. I can't sell them that. Mr. Desjardins looked at her for a long moment. He was, she thought, a more honest man than he'd been 4 years ago. The industry had rubbed some of the gloss off. You could have taken the package I offered you, he said. In 1988, you'd be financially stable right now. I'd be financially stable and farming dead soil, she said, same as everyone else. He nodded slowly. He was not a man accustomed to not having a counteroffer, but he didn't have one. He shook her hand, got back in his truck, and drove down the road through the brown October fields. She watched his taillights until they turned onto the highway. Now let me tell you what happened in the decade after. The years following that second conversation with Mr. Desjardins were the years that mattered most, not in the dramatic way of the early fight, but in the quieter, more lasting way of proof compounding into permanence. The soil organic matter on the Sutton farm continued to climb, slowly, the way real things grow, until by 1996 the average across the property was 2.4%, a number that Dr. Ewan described in a later paper as extraordinary for conventionally cleared prairie cropland. The earthworm populations that Mara had first noticed in year 3 became so dense that she stopped being surprised by them. The mycorrhizal networks that had been destroyed by decades of chemical application rebuilt themselves, visible in autumn root samples as the pale threads that serious soil people get quietly excited about. Mr. Calloway sold his land in 1993. The farm debt crisis had done to him what it had done to hundreds of prairie families. Broken the math beyond any farmer's ability to fix it. He came to see Mara before he left, which she had not expected. He stood at her kitchen door in the same position he'd occupied at his truck window 6 years earlier, and he looked older than she remembered, and tired in the way that prairie men get tired when the land has beaten them. You were right, he said, about the other way. She bought his land, not all of it, and not at a price that felt like anything but fair. She was deliberate about that, because there was a way to buy a neighbor's failed farm that was predatory, and a way that was not, and she intended to be the other kind. She extended her pond system, dug new channels, seeded new populations of perch into the expanded network. She began the slow process of healing soil that had been more damaged than hers had been at the start, and she was patient about it, because she had learned that patience was not a virtue in the inspirational quote sense, but a practical tool, one of the most useful she owned. By 2001, the Sutton farm encompassed 460 acres. It was among the highest yielding operations in the region on a per-acre net return basis, which is the number that matters when you account for what you spent to get the crop. A soil scientist from McGill came to study it. A documentary crew from CBC came and went without her having to say anything particularly quotable, which was a relief. She remained what she had always been, a woman who paid attention to her land and trusted what it told her. She never patented the system. Several people, over the years, asked her why. She always gave the same answer. The system was not hers to patent. It was a version of something the land already knew how to do. She had just listened carefully enough to understand it. Her mother's journals are still in the wooden crate under the bedroom bed. Mara has added her own notebooks alongside them. 12 years of data, observation, water readings, yield records, notes on weather and wildlife, and the particular quality of light in October when the wheat is off and the fields go back to themselves. There is a great niece now, her brother's youngest girl, who visits in summers and has her mother's habit of standing at the edge of the pond and watching the water with a quietness that suggests she is listening for something. Mara does not rush her. She has learned that the understanding you arrive at slowly is the only kind that holds. The story of Mara Sutton is, at its foundation, a story about a particular kind of listening. The men who came to her farm in those early years, the well-meaning neighbor, the extension officer with his clipboard, the salesman with his glossy paper, they all looked at her failing land and saw a problem to be solved with an input. Something to inject, something to apply, something to buy. They were not bad men. They were men who had been trained to see a farm as a machine, and a machine that is failing needs a part replaced. Mara, guided by the quiet scientific instincts of a woman who had spent 4 years studying the way living systems actually functioned, and by the margin notes of a mother who had been watching and wondering for 4 decades, looked at the same land and saw something different. She saw a system that had been disrupted, not broken, disrupted, and that needed, more than anything else, to be allowed to find its way back to itself. The pond, the perch, the channels, the slow circulation of warm, living water through the fields. None of it was magic. All of it was logic. It was the logic of a world that had been doing this without human assistance for a very long time and only needed someone patient enough to help it remember. They had all assumed the fish were the eccentric detail, the grief-addled experiment, the thing that would ultimately prove her wrong, but the fish were never the point. The fish were just the beginning of a conversation between a young woman and 400 acres of exhausted prairie land. A conversation conducted in the patient language of water and to soil and time. The only language in which the land has ever been willing to answer back.